I grew up in a little place called Shiprock, New Mexico, which is home to the Northern Navajo Nation Fair. It rolls around every fall for a couple of days, and like most kids around there, I was taught to have a lot of pride in my people and my culture, especially when it came to the concept of our guardianship over the land. I was born back in 1957, just in time for the hippie movement to sweep the nation around the time of my 10th birthday. The long-haired day trippers over in San Francisco had declared it the Summer of Love and talked about peace, love, and harmony with nature. I could get down with the first two parts for sure, but it was the third part that really struck a chord and resonated with that sense of guardianship I too came to feel. I wanted to protect Dinata, which is the Navajo word for our homeland, and by the time I got to high school, a lot of my friends were dead set on joining the military as a way of doing just that. It was good money. It invoked the warrior spirit of our ancestors, and if you were defending the USA, then you were helping defend the Navajo too, right? I guess a lot of people thought that way, but me personally, I thought they were crazy. It was 1971 when I started high school, and by then, all the bombs, blood, and body bags I'd seen in the newsreels from Vietnam meant I had no intention whatsoever of joining up. I might not have been the sharpest knife in the drawer, but I knew that there were no Viet Cong in San Juan County. But what was in San Juan, and had been since before I was born, were a whole bunch of mining companies who didn't always play by the rules when it came to disposing of toxic waste products. I can't put it all on the mining companies. Unregulated grazing and industrial encroachment had also left scars on the land, but the mining companies had a bad reputation for a damn good reason, because the uranium mines they left abandoned had leached poison into our soil and water. They did the most damage, so to me, it was them that Dinata needed protecting from most. So instead of choosing a warrior's path, I chose a scholar's. I graduated from the University of New Mexico with a bachelor's degree in environmental science in 1975, but in between study sessions, I was volunteering with the Navajo Nation's environmental programs. Working with those programs was a work experience goldmine. Then after graduation, I heard from a professor that the EPA was hiring in Region 6, which covered my home state of New Mexico. The application process was long and tiresome, but after months of waiting, I got a call back for an interview. I wore my best bolo tie, spoke plainly about why I wanted the job, and while I leaned on my fieldwork and studies, I also made it clear that I knew the land as a Navajo, not just as a scientist. A few weeks later, I was offered a position as an environmental scientist with the EPA's Region 6 office based in New Mexico, and it was a dream come true. I started in early 1979, and while the work was challenging, every sample I took and every report I wrote was a step toward protecting our ancestral lands. I carried the weight of my ancestors' teachings, their respect for Mother Earth, into every meeting and every field assignment. But just 5 months into my job, the land that I'd sworn to protect faced a catastrophe that shook all of us to our cores. In the morning of July 16, 1979, at around 5:30 a.m., a dam at the uranium mills up in Church Rock gave way. The breach unleashed over 1,000 tons of radioactive mill tailings, which is sandy, radium-laced debris from uranium processing, and 94 million gallons of radioactive wastewater into the Puerco River, which then flowed downstream by around 80 miles through McKinley and Navajo counties. The spill was even worse than the 3 Mile Island accident which happened earlier that year, but to our shock, we barely made the news. As a Region 6 employee, I was thrown into action almost right away. I joined the teams collecting water and soil samples, and we quickly determined radiation levels in the Puerco River were over 7,000 times the level we'd considered dangerous. We put signs up warning people to avoid the river. Many Navajo families either didn't get the news or had no other choice. Goat herders, for example, were some of the worst affected. Their livestock drank from the river and later died or gave birth to deformed or inviable offspring. Then, to make matters worse, the governor refused to declare a federal disaster area, which left many Navajo communities without aid they urgently required. I knew I was needed at Church Rock, and I knew I could do some good there. So within 24 hours of returning from the testing teams, I was pushing for a transfer. I pressed my supervisors, arguing that my experience with the Navajo Nation's environmental programs made me ideal for the task. And then, in September of '79, my persistence paid off. The EPA approved my reassignment to a long-term monitoring project focused on the Church Rock area, specifically targeting the spread of radioactive contamination beyond the river into surrounding ecosystems. The assignment wouldn't be a glamorous one. There'd be long hours, limited funding, and the obvious dangers of trudging around a potentially radioactive forest all day. But it also meant an opportunity to serve Dinata directly, so without a moment's hesitation, I took it. From the fall of '79 to the winter of '81, I was based out of McGaffey, a small town in the Zuni Mountains about 20 miles south of Church Rock. My work revolved around weekly trips into the wooded area south of the spill where its toxic plume had spread through runoff and wind. There, I'd test trees and soil for radioactive contamination, which posed long-term risks to plants, animals, and people. Every Monday, I'd load up my truck in McGaffey with sampling equipment, Geiger counter, soil corers, and containers for plant samples, then make the 20-mile drive to Church Rock past warning signs faded by the sun and dry washes still stained with a dirt-yellow sediment. In the woods, I followed a grid system mapped out by my EPA colleagues, spending hours taking tree clippings and collecting soil samples to check for radioactive particles. And the results horrified me. The radiation levels in some of my soil samples were over 100 times higher than normal, and certain trees showed elevated radioactivity in their bark and needles. I documented everything, knowing the data I collected could make all the difference when it came to getting the cleanup right. It hurt knowing that I wasn't in a position to outright prevent things like that from happening in the first place, but helping drive the cleanup made me feel like I was really making a difference. I don't regret all the time that I spent helping out. I wouldn't change a thing. But let's just say that I had one or two encounters that made me think that there might be scarier things than radiation out in those woods. You see, in the fall of 1980, about a year into my weekly trips into the woods south of Church Rock, I had an encounter that seriously rattled me, not just as a scientist, but as a Navajo with ties to the land. I was out there working a grid near a dry wash about a mile south of the spill site, when suddenly I saw it. A small, mutated yearling deer that stopped me in my tracks. I just stood up after coring a soil sample, my Geiger counter softly ticking away, when I heard a rustle. I looked up, expecting a rabbit or maybe a coyote, but instead, there it was, no taller than my waist, standing around 20 feet away in a rough clearing. It wasn't aggressive. It just stared at me with one cloudy eye. The other was missing, and there was just a sunken socket in its place, while its head was lopsided from a bulging tumor that pushed its skull out of shape. Its legs were all wrong, with the front right so bent that it hobbled even while standing still, and its fur was patchy too, with bald spots showing scabby, discolored skin and a stunted tail that was barely a nub. It didn't move toward me or flee. It just stood there with its breathing very shallow, like it was too weak to do much of anything else. And my first thought was radiation. Chronic exposure causing mutations, especially in younger animals developing in contaminated areas. This deer's deformities, its cranial asymmetry, missing eye, and limb malformation were almost an exact match with the kinds of things folks saw at Chernobyl in the years that followed. The Puerco River was still an irradiated mess, and the deer either drank from it, grazed on contaminated plants, or its mother drank from it while pregnant and passed the poison on. I noted the location in my field book and made a note of that deer's deformities. It made for a very terrifying sight, but as a Navajo, the sight hit deeper. Our ancestors teach us to live in harmony with animals, almost like their family, so seeing this fawn all twisted up and suffering like that, it felt like a violation of that harmony. I checked my Geiger counter and it spiked slightly, about 0.2 millirem per hour higher than the surrounding area. This suggested the young deer might have been exposed to contaminated sediment. I didn't approach it, partly to avoid scaring it and partly because I didn't want to risk contamination. It watched me for maybe a minute and then limped off into the trees. I didn't follow. Instead, I marked the spot for follow-up sampling, knowing that I need to report the encounter to my EPA team as soon as possible. We'd seen sick livestock. A lot of Navajo herders had lost sheep with similar deformities, but that was my first direct encounter with a wild animal so clearly affected by the spill, and I'm not ashamed to say that it left me very, very shaken. I drove back to McGaffey that evening with a heavy heart. My data would go into a report, and I could no doubt use it to push for more cleanup, but the feeling that poor animal gave me was something that I couldn't put into words. Sometime after, in the summer of 1981, I was still heading out on my weekly monitoring trips when a wildfire broke out in the woods south of Church Rock. One of my coworkers, a fellow scientist named Tom, got caught in the fire's path, and what he claimed to have seen while escaping left me wrestling with both my scientific skepticism and my Navajo roots. It had been an unusually hot and dry July, and the woods were a tinderbox after weeks without rain. Tom had gone out early to collect water samples from a wash near our monitoring grid, about 2 miles south of the spill site. I was in McGaffey testing samples when we got word of smoke rising from the trees, and by morning, reports were coming in of a fast-spreading fire that wind was pushing southwest, directly toward our monitoring area. I was in the office, coordinating with our team, when we lost contact with Tom. The fire was moving too quickly for us to send a truck, and the Forest Service was already stretched thin. We just had to sit tight and pray that he'd be okay. Well, our prayers were answered, and by late afternoon, firefighters found Tom staggering out of the woods near Red Rock. He was barely conscious, black with soot and coughing violently from the severe smoke inhalation, but he was alive. Firefighters rushed him to Gallup Indian Medical Center, where he was treated for burns and respiratory damage. When I visited him the next day, I was relieved to see him alive, but I was incredibly shaken by how close we'd come to losing him. About a week later, when Tom was stable, he gave a statement to the firefighters, and as an EPA official, I got my hands on a copy of their report. It detailed Tom's escape, and as harrowing as it all was, one part stopped me dead cold. Tom said he'd been collecting samples when he noticed the burning smell, and assuming it was some campers that had strayed too far into the exclusion zone, he started walking towards the flame. Then by the time he realized it was a forest fire, the flame was already visible through the trees and the smoke was thickening fast. With the fire closing in, he dropped his gear and just ran, but as he fled, he claimed that he saw something impossible. A huge sphere of flame, about 6 feet around, floating slowly through the woods, maybe 10 to 15 feet off the ground. He said it moved steadily, not flickering like regular flames, but burning up tree trunks as it moved through them. And although he admitted the smoke and the panic made everything a little blurry, he swore it wasn't any kind of hallucination and that he knew what he'd seen. The firefighter's report noted that Tom's account of the sphere was likely a stress-induced misperception of either a large burning branch or debris caught in an updraft. They'd seen no evidence of anything unusual in the burn patterns, just a typical fast-moving wildfire that scorched around 100 acres before containment. But while reading the report in my office, I wasn't so quick to dismiss it. As a Navajo, I'd grown up hearing from elders about strange lights in the woods, small orbs of flame, sometimes called witch lights, that are signs of restless spirits. My grandmother once told me of glowing balls of flames seen at night near sacred sites, and that they were sometimes tied to imbalances in the land. The woods south of Church Rock was now tainted by radioactive waste, and part of me wondered if Tom's sphere was a manifestation of that unrest. But the scientist in me pushed back hard. I'd studied fire behavior in my environmental science courses. Wildfires can create optical illusions like burning gases or superheated air distorting light. On top of that, Tom's smoke inhalation, in combination with carbon monoxide levels high enough to cause confusion, could have easily warped his perception. I checked the fire's burn data and read samples from the area showing no unusual chemical residues, just the standard combustion markers you see in any regular forest fire. Radiation levels in the soil, already elevated from the spill, hadn't spiked any further. In fact, the firefighters said they thought it was a freak lightning strike that started the blaze, and that there was no physical evidence of anything like a floating sphere of flame. But I still couldn't shake that sense of unease. I drove out to the burn site the following week and walked the charred section of the forest where Tom had been. The woods were this weird mix of ash and charred tree trunks, and my Geiger counter clicked at the expected level, nothing out of the ordinary. But standing there, I felt the weight of the land's pain. Not just from the spill, but the fire, too. I said a quiet prayer for balance, not to mention Tom's recovery, and when I filed my report, his words were a reminder that some things in those woods defy explanation. But as for other things, no matter how frightening they are, they often have very rational and logical explanations. In the fall of 1979, just a few months into my reassignment to the cleanup effort, I witnessed something that haunts me to this day. something far worse than any mutated animal or wildfire scare. I was out on a routine sampling trip in early September, and my grid that day took me to a rocky outcrop about 1.5 miles south of the spill site, near a small cave tucked into a sandstone ridge. I was testing the trees and soil for radium-226, with my Geiger counter clicking away, when I heard a low groan from inside the cave. It sounded like a wounded animal, maybe a coyote or a deer, hurt and hiding, and I froze and listened. Then the sound came again, so guttural and full of pain that it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I thought that it might be a sick animal, so I set down my corer and approached the mouth of the cave, calling out softly as to not startle whatever was inside. Seconds after I started calling out, it crawled out into the sunlight, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't an animal. It was a man, or at least, what was left of one. His skin was peeling off in patches, black, rotten, and oozing with sores that glistened in the light. His jaw was just kind of hanging slack, and his tongue lolled out of his mouth, very swollen, discolored, while his eyes were cloudy circles, sunken in a face that looked more like a corpse than a living person. He dragged himself forward on bony arms, his legs too weak to stand, moaning with each movement. At first I thought he was another mutation, like the animals that I'd feared, but as he emerged, I saw the tattered jeans he was wearing and realized this was a person that had been ravaged by advanced radiation sickness. And my heart was pounding. Nothing I'd ever seen before had ever frightened me so much, but my training kicked in all the same. I knew acute radiation poisoning when I saw it. The skin necrosis, the lesions, the way it looked like he was wasting away. This man had been exposed to extreme levels of radioactivity, likely from lingering in the spill zone where radium and thorium saturated the soil and water. I ran to my truck, grabbed my water canteen, and started begging for mechanics over my radio. I then ran back to the injured man, keeping my distance to avoid contamination, and offered him some water. He tried to drink it, but his throat was so swollen that he couldn't swallow, and he almost choked before coughing and expelling what he'd tried to drink. His groans were weaker by then, his breathing very ragged, but I stayed with him, speaking softly and trying to reassure him he'd be okay until a Forest Service crew arrived with a stretcher. They rushed him to that medical center, but sadly, I learned later that he died in the hospital. My soil samples from near that cave showed radium levels 100 times above those considered safe, enough to kill anyone who lingered there unprotected, and later I got my hands on a copy of that report. He was a hermit, a Navajo man in his 50s who was known to live off and on in the woods near Church Rock. No one knew his full story. Some said that he'd been a miner, others said that he just preferred solitude. But what we knew for certain was he'd either ignored or never heard the EPA's warnings to stay away from the contaminated area. The spill's toxic plume had spread through the washes and into the caves where he likely took shelter. There was also a good chance that he'd been contaminated by drinking from tainted streams or eating tainted plants. Autopsy reports confirmed a lethal radiation exposure. His bone marrow was destroyed, his organs failing, and his skin was literally rotting from the inside out. I was furious, and I wasn't the only one. The spill's radioactive tailings, left largely unclean by United Nuclear, had poisoned the land, and this man had paid the ultimate price. I wrote it up in my report, pushing for more aggressive cleanup and better outreach to remote communities. I'd seen sick animals and polluted rivers, but this was different. He was one of us, a Dine, lost to the poison we were fighting. That night in McGaffey, I sat outside, staring at the stars and prayed for forgiveness for not doing enough. But the conclusions to those prayers only hardened my resolve to keep testing and keep fighting so that no one else had to crawl out of a cave, rotting from the inside out while still alive. And by the winter of 1981, my time at Church Rock had ended when the EPA reassigned me to other projects across New Mexico. Resources were tight, and the spill, despite being the largest radioactive disaster in the nation's history, faded from the headlines and the agency's focus shifted. I had to move on to new assignments, but the memories of Church Rock clung to me like the red dust on my boots. The mutated fawn limping through the woods, the strange fireball my coworker swore he saw in the wildfire, and worst of all, that hermit crawling from the cave, his skin rotting from radiation sickness. All those images have been completely tattooed onto my consciousness. The memories pushed me to keep going, to keep fighting the good fight for my people and our land, even when the odds felt stacked against us. But above all, the spill had exposed how little the government prioritized Navajo lands. Church Rock was a hard lesson in reality. United Nuclear barely cleaned up 1% of the 1,100 tons of spilled waste, and the Puerco River stayed toxic with radium levels still far above safe limits. Families were still too afraid to drink from their wells, herders were losing livestock, and the deep distrust of federal promises grew even deeper. I carried the weight of what I'd seen, the hermit's groans, the fawn's twisted limbs, and used it to drive my work forward. There were no easy fixes, no heroes swooping in to save the day. The land was still contaminated and the threat to my people remained. But those 2 years taught me to stay in the fight and to keep pushing for our homeland's health, even when everything seems stacked against us. The creepiest, most frightening story I know didn't come from a John Carpenter movie or a Stephen King book. It came from a little old lady that I met out on a hike one day out near Cross Timbers Park here in Kansas. I was in my late 30s, and hiking had become my way of taking a break from the daily grind. I liked the quiet, the way it cleared my head and kept me grounded. So, one warm afternoon in late spring, I decided to drive up to the state park to hit the trails and work off some stress. That day, the park was dead silent, and I felt like I was the only one around for miles. I'd been walking for a couple of hours following a trail near the edge of the park that wound past little clearings when I stumbled onto something I wasn't expecting. In a small meadow surrounded by trees with the late afternoon sunlight poking through them, I found 4 graves. The headstones were old and beat up, leaning a bit like they were worn out from standing there so long. I got closer, brushing away some tall grass to read them. The names were faded and tough to make out, but I could tell they were all from the same family, brothers and a father it looked like. There was nothing weird about family being buried right next to each other, especially back then. But the thing that really caught my eye and sent a little shiver down my spine was how they all had the same date of death, April 7th of 1859. I remember standing there staring at those stones, wondering what could have taken out a whole family in just one day. Was it a sickness of some kind, maybe some kind of accident, or was it something darker? My curiosity got going, and I couldn't help but hang around trying to figure it out. Then as I was poking around the graves, I heard footsteps crunching behind me. I turned and saw a woman walking across the meadow towards me. She looked to be in her late 50s, and without trying to sound mean, she didn't look like she took care of herself too good. She looked sharp, though, and had this serious, determined look in her eyes as she approached. She asked why I was trespassing on her land, and when I assured her that I didn't mean to and I was just interested in the graves, she softened up on me a little. I told her I was just hiking through the park, and I guess I just strayed off the trail a little too far, and then I told her my name and said it was a pleasure to meet her. And that made her smile, and after telling me her name was Martha, she said she was the great-great-granddaughter of one of the men buried there. Hearing that was kind of exciting, I guess, because it meant that there was a chance that she knew what happened to them. Then when I asked, as delicately as possible by the way, it almost seemed like she'd been waiting for someone to show some interest in them. Without me asking too much, she launched into the story of her doomed forefathers, a tale her family had passed down for years, and let me tell you, that juice was well worth the squeeze. She started by explaining the times her great-great-grandfather lived in. They called it Bleeding Kansas back then, a messy, violent period when people were fighting over whether Kansas would be a free state or a slave state, and her great-great-grandfather, a guy named Ezekiel, found his family caught up in that. And back then, the state of Kansas was flooded with weaponry. The New England Emigrant Aid Company would send what appeared to be crates of Bibles to the Free Staters, but the crates were actually filled with Sharps rifles, or what they called Beecher's Bibles back then. The slavers got shipments too, mostly from pro-slavery supporters from Missouri, but also from sympathizers in the wider South. It was like a practice round for the Civil War, which came a few years after, and it was also complete chaos too, so a lot of those shipments I mentioned there didn't make it into the hands of those they were intended for. Which brings me nicely to the fly-by-night firearm traders that were roaming around, selling stolen or misplaced weapons to anyone with a few bucks to buy them. Ezekiel, I was told, had gone into the woods one day to meet one such rifle salesman. He wanted rifles and shotguns to keep his family safe from the slavers that might raid his family farm, but since he didn't have the time to ride all the way into Colleyville or Toronto to visit an established gun store, he took a chance with the man in the woods. But after heading out into the trees, poor old Ezekiel never made it back home. His father and brothers started to get worried about him, so off they went into the woods to find him. But then instead of bringing home their kin alive and well, all they found was his body. Zeke wasn't just dead either. He was torn up real bad, mutilated like something unholy had been done to him. Martha said she was told that it looked like some kind of ritual, though she'd never been told the gorier details. I could picture it though, at least in my imagination, and boy did it give me the creeps. As you can imagine, Zeke's family didn't just let it go, and they swore a terrible and bloody revenge against the people who murdered him. They heard a guy in the next town over was selling rifles in the exact same way, as in organizing meetups in the woods. So Ezekiel's pa and brothers rode out there to track him down. They asked around, got the townsfolk to tell them where the salesman was hiding, and then headed into the woods to get revenge. But just like Ezekiel, they didn't come back. A couple of days later, someone found their horses tied to some trees near an old wooden church that had been left to rot. A search party went out, found the falling down church, and then they searched the place to rule out the missing men being inside. But when they stepped inside, there they were, lying on the rotted wood planks with the bodies of Ezekiel's father and brothers. It appeared they'd shot each other dead, but no one could figure out why or how it happened. Martha said the county sheriff got called in, who brought his bloodhounds to the church. The dogs sniffed out the trails of the 3 dead men, but there was a 4th scent, someone they couldn't identify. The sheriff and his deputies then followed the 4th trail through the woods until it led to an old cave. But the bloodhounds, who were usually bold as brass, wouldn't go near it. They just whimpered and backed off like they were scared of whoever or whatever was inside. The deputies checked it out anyway, but all they found were some old clothes and animal bones. There was no sign of the 4th person. I remember how, when she got to that part of the story, Martha stopped talking for a few moments as her gaze wandered off, like she was seeing that cave in her mind's eye. And then she told me what she thought happened, and theory or not, what she said sent a chill through me. When she said she believed her forefathers ran into the devil himself, she was dead serious. She believed this thing of evil tricked them into killing each other by feeding them lies. She thought about it long and hard, and she couldn't think of anything else that properly explained it. Her forefathers were good men, she said, but that's all they were, men. Martha then quoted a Bible verse about how men were vulnerable to the devil's ways, saying, "Many a victim has he laid low, and all his slain are a mighty throng." I wasn't sure what to think. I asked if there could have been another explanation, or if there was some kind of family feud she didn't know about. She just shook her head and said that she knows the devil walks the earth, looking for people who are weak or angry. Her family was both, she reckoned, grieving Ezekiel and out for blood. According to her, it made them easy pickings. I didn't argue with her. I could see she believed it with all her heart, and honestly, the story was heavy enough without me trying to poke holes in it. 4 guys from one family, all gone in such a brutal way. Devil or no devil, it was pretty messed up. And we stood there by the graves for a while, not saying much of anything, just taking everything in. And then, as the sun started to go down, I thanked her for telling me the story, and she gave me this small, sad smile in response. She said it mattered to keep their memory alive, that they didn't deserve what happened to them. I nodded in agreement, thanked her for the story, and then said my goodbyes and got back on the trail. I tried to focus my mind elsewhere, trying to figure out how long it'd take before I was back home and preparing dinner. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about Martha's story, and the more I thought about it, the more the woods didn't quite feel the same anymore. Before, they'd been peaceful, but then it felt like they were hiding something. In the days that followed, I thought about Ezekiel heading into the woods to buy those guns, just trying to keep his family safe in a crazy time. I also thought about his father and brothers, torn up over losing him, and then going after the guy they thought did it. Something went very, very wrong in that church. Something bad enough for them to turn their guns on each other, but how? Was it the salesman? Did he mess with their heads somehow? Or was it something else? Something more in line with what Martha said about them dealing with the devil? That cave part nagged at me too. Who was that fourth person? Was the salesman working alone, or was there someone else involved? And why the hell did those dogs freak out so much? Those old clothes and the animal bones had to be a clue too, but to what? I had no idea. Maybe the rifle salesman was a crook, luring people to rob them, or worse. And then he could have set up Ezekiel's family somehow and got them to fight each other. But that didn't explain the cave or the dogs acting spooked, not to mention Ezekiel's body being all cut up like it was. That made it sound more like the work of some bloodthirsty lunatic than a straight-up robbery. Martha's devil idea was way out there, but I understood why she chose to believe it. Back then, with all the chaos and death, people probably saw the devil everywhere. He was an easy way to explain the unexplainable. Personally, I wasn't sold on it, but I couldn't shake that idea. And even now, I sometimes find myself picturing it in my head. Ezekiel meeting that salesman, the family finding his body, the shootout in the church, and the cave with its secrets. I didn't have answers, and maybe I never would. But that connection to the past, those lives lost in a place I just walked through, it hit me hard. And that was enough to keep me thinking about it for a long, long time. About 20 years ago now, me and an old mate of mine from school decided to go camping. We've been wanting to camp there for a while because it's one of the largest patches of ancient woodland in the whole of the UK. And since Ozzy and the boys recorded Sabbath Bloody Sabbath at Clearwell Castle, it felt like a bit of a heavy metal pilgrimage. But while both me and my mate were fans of scary music, we most definitely didn't enjoy the little run-in that we had near the little pond we found. We used to camp out the back of my car, basically, so after driving up and down forest roads for a while, we found this little side path that ran adjacent to a large pond. There was enough room for us to park the car and still leave room for people to pass us on the path, so we thought that'd be as good a place as any to stop over for the night. Camping there wasn't strictly legal, but we were used to skirting a bit of bureaucracy so we could have a nicer campsite. We didn't make campfires anywhere like that, and we certainly didn't damage any trees or anything. We weren't vandals, so unless a real job's worth came along and threatened to call the police, we were generally free to do as we pleased. Anyway, we parked just off the path, set up our tents, and had some sandwiches for dinner. Then, after watching the sun go down over a few beers and some songs on a portable player, we hit the hay with the intention of staying another night there. But when we woke up the next morning, my mate found a note on his car windshield that just said, "Leave." And I won't lie, we were definitely a bit creeped out knowing someone had been walking around our tents while we'd been asleep. But to be honest, it wasn't the first time something like that had happened. You get kids playing pranks, passive-aggressive note leavers telling you they've informed the National Trust or whatever, and even the occasional dogger who doesn't realize you're even there on the other side of a bush. And on this occasion, we thought it was most probably kids playing a joke on us. The note leavers are generally quite verbose and will leave you a tidy little paragraph explaining why exactly you're so evil for camping on public land. But kids or teenagers trying to scare you will generally leave you a nice little DIE or "we are watching" or, in this case, "leave." I asked my mate if he reckoned that we should relocate, even if it was just to the other side of the forest, and I sort of agreed with him when he said no. If the kids or teenagers came back, we'd chase them off and give them a scare of their own, all in good fun, of course, but we certainly weren't going to give them the satisfaction of obeying their single-word order. After that, we were planning on having a walk into the nearby town to get some food and see what pubs they had on offer. But after suggesting that whoever left the note might still be watching us, my mate suddenly wasn't so keen on leaving all of our stuff alone, and we decided to pack away before driving into town to get some food. We found a decent pub, had some food and a swift half, and then as we were sat at the bar, my mate starts talking about going back into the forest and camping in a new spot. It did feel massively emasculating having moved on at the behest of what were probably just some kids playing tricks on us, so to claw back a bit of our pride, we agreed to head back into the forest of Dean to spend our final night of camping there. So, after lunch, we drove back into the forest and repeated the process of driving up and down the little roads in an attempt to find their camping spot. Eventually we found one, and this time we made sure it was much more secluded than the first. We weren't exactly scared yet, apprehensive of getting our stuff damaged or stolen, but not scared. But then as we set up the tents and got our sixers of beer out of the car boot, my mate saw someone walking towards us down the track. First I heard of it was him going, Jay, in this whispered voice, and the second J was said immediately after the first and sounded urgent in the extreme. I turned around fast and saw a man walking down the track towards us. He had a baseball cap on, with a jumper, jeans, and boots, but covering his face from the eyes down was a scarf, and in his hand he carried some big wood-chopping axe with a red blade. We didn't try and talk to the guy, and I'm sad to say that I left about 100 quid's worth of camping gear and my beers behind. But we hopped into my car the second I saw him, and then since we had to drive past this guy to actually make it back to the road, I gunned my car right at him, so he had to move and couldn't take a swing at us as we passed. We made an anonymous call to the police from the road, not wanting to give away that we'd been breaking the law, but also not wanting some masked psycho to get away with brandishing some axe at us. We assumed it was him that had left that note, too. But who he was and why he'd done it were things we were never able to work out. I suppose there are some proper weirdos out there, and we were always a bit more careful about where we camped after that. On a chilly November morning back in 1985, a hunter was quietly plodding through the forests of Bear Brook State Park near Allenstown, New Hampshire. Located around 15 miles from the state capital of Concord, the park spans over 10,000 acres of wetlands and rolling forests, making it one of the state's largest areas of natural beauty. Bear Brook also offers a network of trails for hiking, biking, and horseback riding, tracks which weave through dense woods that teem with wildlife. Yet the park's tranquil beauty belies a darker history, marked by a series of grim discoveries which cast a somber shadow over the serene landscape. This is the story of the bodies in the barrels. As the hunter walked near the charred ruins of an old burned-down general store, his eyes caught a glint of metal from some nearby underbrush. Curiosity got the better of him. Then, on closer inspection, he found the glint belonged to the rusted metal of a 55-gallon oil drum. Unable to temper his burning curiosity, the man heaved the drum upright and then pried its lid from its moorings. But when he did so, he was faced with a picture of pure horror. Stuffed into the drum were the plastic-wrapped bodies of two young women. The oldest was likely in her 20s or early 30s, while the much younger girl was perhaps 8 to 10 years old. Autopsies later revealed that the cause of death for both individuals had been brutal blunt force trauma. Yet while it was easy to determine how they died, discerning who they were was a far more difficult task. The older of the two victims was a young Caucasian, perhaps in her late 20s or early 30s, but with traces of Native American ancestry. Her teeth, marked by multiple fillings and 3 extractions, hinted at a life of personal and perhaps familial neglect. She also had curly brown hair and was somewhere between 5'2" and 5'7" tall. Found beside her was a girl no older than 11, but possibly as young as 5, and she bore signs of a hard life. In life, she stood between 4'3" and 4'6" tall, and pneumonia had severely scarred her lungs. She had a crooked front tooth. There were noticeable gaps between her top teeth, but unlike the older females, her teeth bore no fillings. Police appealed to the public for information, but when no one came forward to claim the nameless victims, they were laid to rest in an Allenstown cemetery under a simple tombstone bearing the following inscription: "Here lies the mortal remains, known only to God, of a woman aged 23 to 33 and a girl child aged 8 to 10. Their slain bodies were found on November 10, 1985, in Bear Brook State Park. May their souls find peace in God's loving care." For a long, long time, it seemed the females' identities would forever remain a mystery. Yet 15 years later, on May 9th of the year 2000, the woods whispered another secret. Near the exact same spot the first barrel was found, investigators uncovered a second 55-gallon drum lying just below the original crime scene's boundaries. Somehow, it had been missing during the initial search, and inside were the remains of 2 children. They too had been dispatched via blunt force trauma. The older child had been between the ages of 2 and 4 years old when she was murdered and had stood at a mere 3 feet 8 inches tall. The police also determined her pronounced overbite, along with a gap between her front teeth, may have given her a distinctive and easily recognizable smile. Investigators later determined she may have battled anemia during her brief existence, while DNA samples revealed she was the daughter of a man named Terry Peder Rasmussen. The youngest was between the ages of 1 and 3 years old, a toddler whose life was cut short before it could truly begin. She stood between 2 feet 1 and 2 feet 6 inches tall, had long blonde or light brown hair, and like the others, she had a gap between her 2 front teeth. In the early days in the investigation, detectives cast a wide net, sharing details of the case across the United States and into parts of Canada, and what amounted to a desperate search for answers. They chased down hundreds of leads, ruling out at least 10 possible identities for the victims in the process. But even after weeks upon weeks of solid investigation, the names of the woman and 3 girls remained elusive. In June of 2013, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children breathed new life into the case by unveiling a series of updated facial reconstructions. These weren't just sketches, they were digitally rendered images which included important physiological details such as the gaps and overbites that shaped the victims' faces. They were, however, rendered in a haunting black and white, as their skin tones and eye colors were details that had not yet been determined. As science advanced, so did the clues, because in 2015, DNA profiling unlocked a key piece of the puzzle. Analysis of their mitochondrial DNA showed the oldest victim was the mother of the 2 youngest, and they were believed to have lived together in the northeastern United States for at least 2 weeks to 3 months prior to their deaths. They must have moved to the Bear Brook area not too long before their deaths, possibly in an attempt to escape their killer. DNA analysis also confirmed that the 3rd child was indeed the daughter of Terry Peder Rasmussen, a serial killer who'd passed away in prison back in 2010. He was convicted of just 1 murder, but was linked to at least 5 more in a series of crimes that stretched across the country between 1978 and 2002. Due to his use of many aliases, most notably Bob Evans, Rasmussen became known by the chilling moniker, the Chameleon Killer. In 1999, a young man posted a message on the website Ancestry.com hoping to find Sarah, an older half-sister he'd never met, who was born in California during her father's time in the Marines. Nearly 2 decades later, in October 2018, a librarian turned amateur detective named Rebecca Heath stumbled across the man's post while scouring the internet for clues to the identities of the Bear Brook victims. After digging deeper, Heath learned that Sarah's mother, Marlise Honeychurch, had an older daughter from a previous marriage, and their ages chillingly aligned with the 3 related victims found in Allenstown barrels. Another breakthrough came when a relative Heath contacted revealed that Marlise had married a man named Rasmussen. Convinced that she had cracked the case, Heath shared her discovery with Detective Peter Headley, setting the stage for a long overdue reckoning. On June 6, 2019, New Hampshire police had a press conference in which they revealed the identities of 3 of the Bear Brook victims. The eldest was Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch, born in 1954, and her daughters were Marie Elizabeth Vaughn, born in 1971, and Sarah Lynn McWaters, born in 1977. The family had vanished from their home in La Puente, California around Thanksgiving of 1978. And it was deemed no coincidence that Marlise had been dating Terry Peder Rasmussen at the time. Following a heated argument with her mother, Marlise stormed out, taking her daughters with her and cutting all ties with her family. She then began using the alias Elizabeth Evans for legal documents in May of 1980, no doubt as an attempt to avoid being found. According to friends, Marlise's life prior to meeting Rasmussen had been a tapestry of failed relationships. She married Marie's father in June of 1971, but divorced him just a few years later in 1974. She then wed young Sarah's father in September of that same year, but they too separated shortly after their engagement. By the time she began dating Rasmussen, Marlise had regained custody of both her daughters, but unfortunately, this put them right in the clutches of one of America's most elusive serial killers. In 2002, Terry Peder Rasmussen was found guilty of murdering his then-wife, Un Sun-jun. His pattern involved forming relationships with women and their children, often living with them for months or years before killing them. The Bear Brook victims were killed by blunt force trauma, then dismembered and disposed of in barrels, exactly the way Rasmussen disposed of Sun Jun. But what sets the Bear Brook murders apart from his other works of malice is that in this case, Rasmussen chose to murder his own daughter, his own flesh and blood. Over the years, many have asked why, but unfortunately, it seems his motivation will forever remain a mystery. In November 2019, a funeral was held in Allenstown to honor Marlise and Marie. Their names were etched on a new headstone to replace the one that had mourned them as unknowns. While family members, including some of Marlise's relatives and Rasmussen's daughter from his first marriage, gathered to say goodbye. Little Sarah, on the other hand, was laid to rest in Connecticut, closer to her father's family at the behest of her elderly paternal grandparents. Marlise Honeychurch, Marie Vaughn, and Sarah McWaters each had their lives cut short before being buried in rusted oil drums, but they were lucky enough to have their names restored. The same cannot be said for the fourth child's identity. Known only as Rasmussen's daughter through advanced DNA testing, the identity of the young girl found in the second drum remains a mystery. Her mother is believed to be one of Rasmussen's victims, but much like her daughter, her exact identity remains unknown. In 2021, forensic investigators traced the fourth girl's lineage to relatives in Pearl River County, Mississippi, while around the same time, Rasmussen's daughter from his first marriage shared a haunting memory. Andrea Steers believes she met this girl, whom she calls Jane Doe, when they were both very young and recalls her quite possibly being half Asian. Yet even with so many pieces of the puzzle having already fallen into place, the full story of this child still lingers in the shadows, waiting to be told. The Bear Brook murders, having been shrouded in mystery for decades, paint a haunting picture of loss and resilience, where the persistent pursuit of truth reclaimed lost identities from the clutches of a serial killer. In one case, the investigation was taken up by an unpaid member of the general public, a librarian who dedicated her spare time to delivering answers to those who needed them most. Rasmussen might have forced his own personal darkness on the world, but it seems for every one monster who sows pain and death, there are hundreds of good-natured citizens lighting candles to guide the way. May they be commended, and may they continue their fight against evil until, God willing, there is no more evil to fight. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations.